Hi, everyone. Mark Tressigan. Uh, we are still in module 2 of Informing Creative Development, and we are going to talk about, let me share this screen, learning and memory. I like this quote here: "Attention is a reward, not a right. People need to care enough to engage and spend time with us." Right? As we've discussed on all of these, what is this certificate about and how does this fit in? It's about applying a modern consumer-centric approach to the development and optimization of marketing activities, identify business goals and strategies relevant to that campaign, assess the requirements and make a plan to support those business goals, develop actionable insights, integrate those into a creative asset, evaluate how media is going to work with that creative, and then measure the effectiveness of that campaign. The Informing Creative Development builds on what you had and learned in Foundations, and as well as other courses in the certificate. And what you'll walk away from this course with is to justify the role of research through creative, recommend research approaches, design and recommend the appropriate research plan, integrate insights into a creative brief, recommend the actual research methods, then create a story-driven analysis and lead effective conversations across stakeholders. So as you know, we are in module 2. There are 3 lectures in here. This is learning and memory. Right, so the second of the 3 in this session. So let's talk and start with talking about learning. What is learning and how do we learn? There's a number of ways people learn beyond the learning model we all sort of grew up with, which is intense instruction and studying. We also learn from experience, from observing events that affect other people. And we often learn when we don't even realize we are learning, like in the perception module, in the Darren Brown video, right? Incidental learning. We learn things even though we don't know how we learned them. And it's an ongoing process and never ends. Even though we're not sitting down and studying, we are often learning things and integrating them into our beliefs and understanding of the world. And there are 2 main theories of learning, one called cognitive theory, which helps us solve complex problems, and behavioral theory, which is about there's a stimulus and we have a response to that. On cognitive theory, there's this model called the constructivist learning theory, which emphasizes that learners are actively participating in building, right? So we start out here unconsciously incompetent. We don't know what we don't know, but we know we can't do it. Consciously incompetent. You know the skill, but you have not mastered it. We are consciously competent. We can do it, but it takes work. And then we are unconsciously competent. We execute that skill naturally, almost without thinking about it. So that's one model. Behavioral learning theory is a little more complicated, and there are a few of them that this assumes that learning takes place as a result of responses to some other event. And we observe what happens around us and we react to it. Some of the ones you may have heard of: classical conditioning, stimulus generalization, and halo effect. So classical condition is that a stimulus elicits a response, and that's paired with another stimulus that initially does not elicit a response on its own. Over time, the second stimulus causes a similar response because we associate it with the first stimulus. So the famous Pavlov's dog experiment, right? Food is the unconditional stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus. A bell being rung when the food is offered is a conditioned stimulus. And drooling is the conditioned response that happens not to the food, but to the bell, because the bell and the food have become associated with each other. Repetition of this conditioning strengthens the response. Stimulus generalization is that the tendency of similar stimuli to evoke the same conditioned response. Pavlov noticed that the dog would salivate when they heard other sounds besides the bell, so that stimulus of the bell became generalized to other sounds. And halo effect occurs when consumers react the same with a similar product, not the same, right? The example would be private label branding that resembles the leading brand, like in this example here. What are marketing applications of classical conditioning? Well, building brand equity is classical conditioning. The pairing of a brand name with product attributes or product or brand equities is an example of classical conditioning. This is what marketers spend a significant portion of their budget doing. These associations are extremely important to marketers. They create value for the brand. When brands have built equities, there are tangible values to those equities, and it differentiates the brand from competitors, right? So a brand equity is a brand has strong positive associations in the consumer's memory. That's what brand building and a lot of advertising is seeking to do. Sometimes the association is so strong, the brand name becomes the name for the category, right? Band-Aids is a brand name, but when people are talking about bandages for a cut on your finger, they don't say, give me Band-Aid brand bandages or give me a bandage. They say, give me a Band-Aid, right? Repetition, right? One school of thought is that seeing an advertisement 3 times is ideal. It creates awareness, demonstrates relevance to consumers, and reminds us of the benefits. A challenge is that we know consumers do not consciously process all of the information they're exposed to. We saw this in the previous lecture. On the other hand, seeing an ad too many times, we talked about this in the key terminology, can cause advertising wear out. The ad no longer has an impact on consumers. That's why marketers create variations of an ad, pull-outs we talked about, to keep the message fresh and unique in consumers' minds. Stimulus generalization. There are 4 different ways this happens. One is called family branding. You capitalize on the reputation of the company name, also known as a house of brands or an endorser brand. So within Unilever are all these brands, and they are known as distinct entities. Breyers, Good Humor, Knorr, Skippy. These are all distinct brands with distinct personalities. The Unilever only serves at best as an endorser because people know Unilever stands for quality and things like that, right? That's a family branding strategy. Product line extension or a branded house is where you use that corporate name across all of the different services or products that you offer, right? So you've seen this with Virgin, where you have Virgin Airways, Virgin Atlantic. At one point, they had Virgin Records, Virgin Holidays, Vacations, all the different FedExes, all the different Dove products, all under that same branded name, leveraging the equity of that parent brand equity. Right? Here it is with Apple. They've done it with right? iPad, iPhone. They've also done it with Mac, MacBook, Mac, AirPods, right? So they have a few of them, but they all use this sort of branded house, leveraging the equity of the parent brand. Licensing is another way, renting well-known brand names, hoping that the learned associations they have forged rub off on the other brand products. Celebrity endorsements are a form of licensing, right? You're borrowing the equities of that celebrity. Lookalike packaging, you see this a lot with private label and generic brands where the packaging, as we talked about just before with mouthwash, look strikingly similar to the brand named product. And this is done by design because we know that stimulus generalization evokes the same types of responses in consumers when it looks similar. Marketers work very hard to protect their designs and logos from infringement, and they take legal action to prevent it. And the standard of this is pretty much, will the consumer be confused by the other name, right? Now, in some of these are clearly in different categories, right? Dove skin products and Dove ice cream, Domino's pizza, Domino's sugar, right? These are clearly in different categories. But what happens when they're in a similar or adjacent category, where you have the Hershey's Chocolate Company in Pennsylvania? Everyone knows Hershey's chocolate. And the Hershey's Creamery Company, also of Pennsylvania, but they just sell ice cream. Honestly, I was confused. The first time I saw Hershey's ice cream on a retail store, I assumed it was Hershey's chocolate. Even the logos look similar, even though the colors are different and the font is slightly different. It looked similar enough. I was confused. But this was litigated, and it was deemed that these are distinct categories and therefore not the same, and therefore consumer confusion would not result. I was confused, but maybe that's just me. Instrumental or operant conditioning occurs when we learn to perform behaviors that produce positive outcomes and avoid negative outcomes, right? This is the classic experiment that was done with mice or rats, and food versus a shock coming out, right? So the rat or the mouse is very much attracted to the food, but wants to try and avoid the pain, right? And instrumental conditioning occurs in one of three ways. There's a positive reinforcement, a negative reinforcement of the behavior we're looking for, and then a punishment for not adhering to what the behavior should be. The difference between these two is that in classical conditioning, responses are involuntary and simple, right? So classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog, whereas in operant conditioning, the responses are deliberate to obtain a goal, and they're more complex, right? So I don't want to do this, I do want to do that. They're much more conscious as well. Here's operant conditioning at work, right? Before conditioning, there was an image people had of Christmas, right? And there was an image people had of it being happy, excitement, family. Yeah. Before conditioning, Coca-Cola didn't really have associations. There was sort of no conditioned response to it. When Coke leveraged Christmas as part of campaigns, then that unconditioned response of excitement, happiness, and family got transferred to Coca-Cola. So now Coca-Cola, by way of associating itself with Christmas, took, borrowed, leveraged some of those equities of Christmas. Again, this is marketing at work. It's building associative networks in people's minds, right? Let's talk about memory a little bit, right? Memory is a more complicated construct than most people might imagine, with multiple steps in it. The process of acquiring information and storing it over time so that it'll be available when we need it is kind of the definition of memory, right? Information processing, the mind is in some way like a computer. You feed information in, it gets stored there. But there are stages to memory. There is encoding, which is information enters the brain in some recognizable form. There is storage, which means it gets integrated into knowledge which is already stored in your brain. And then there is retrieval, which is accessing that desired information. The model really looks like this. There is sensory information, right? And this is sort of sensory memory, temporary storage of sensory information. You felt something, you heard something, you saw something. The capacity for this is very high, but the duration is very short. It stays there for a second, this says, right? So some short period. Then there is attention. Information that passes through an attentional gate is transferred to short-term memory. This is brief storage of information currently being used. So this is, I'm using this pencil and I have to see how much eraser is there, right? So it's limited, it's short-term, but I'm using that information actively. Something called elaborative rehearsal, information subjected to elaborative rehearsal or deep processing, meaning we think about its meaning, is then transferred to long-term memory. So I feel this pencil in my hand is sensory. Short-term is I have to do something with it. And then long-term memory is the meaning of this is that I can take notes and remember things. Yeah. As a marketer, we often think about how much information can you hope to convey to the sensory, the short term, and the working memory. Remember that our stimulus is very short term, and by meaning, we have to work a certain way. This great chart from Cantor and Millward Brown shows that how much people recall a message when there is only one message in a piece of communication, how much they recall that message when there are two, and when there are three. And you can see that once you get past one message, the likelihood that people are going to retain it drops off pretty precipitously with each additional message that you add. This is just sort of an interesting bit that I've seen leveraged in advertising. There's something called the Zeigarnik effect, which is that people tend to remember unfinished or interrupted tasks better than completed tasks, right? And it plays on the human tendency to crave resolution of things. The effect was actually tested on advertising jingles, and the findings were that people recalled ad content better with known jingles than those without known jingles, as viewers were focused on hearing the jingle. But if you interrupted the jingle, so I know the jingle goes like this, somehow you interrupted it, that prompted even better attention and recall. That unexpected interruption, the Zeigarnik effect, actually created better recall, right? How do you use that in marketing? You can ask people to fill in the blanks. It has to be what? Blank. That unfinished thought actually embeds it in memory better. The cliffhanger, right? It's coming home. What's coming home, right? That stores it in memory better. Experiences that reward completion and get people involved in getting past that interrupted task drive memory stronger. There are two types of memory, if you think about it. There's remembering things that have happened to us already, things from the past, and remembering things that have to happen, things I have to do in the future, right? And these two types of memory work together because memory is sort of there to help us choose. Their entire purpose is to help us make decisions in the present that will impact our future. That's the whole purpose of memory. And if you think about it, an incoming piece of information gets stored in what we call an associative network. Other things we associate with a brand or product influences how we remember it. So if I say to you BMW, within a fraction of a second, your brain starts connecting to everything else you've ever associated with BMW. So you may say BMW, car, luxury, expensive, ultimate driving machine, German. You may even say Autobahn. You may say Angela Merkel. And then you go, no, that's too far. And all this happens within fractions of a second. Your brain resolves on what they call a neuronal cloud of understanding. What you understand about BMW, the things you have connected to BMW in the past, right? So that means it's going to be different for everyone, because what I've connected to BMW in my brain may be different from what you've connected to BMW in your brain. But this associative network works for everything. This is how our brains work. We associate things with a brand or a stimulus or whatever, and that becomes our understanding of what that thing is. Things that have been repeated more often, we have seen stimuli that connects BMW and ultimate driving machine more often, those will come to us more quickly and be more firmly rooted in our associative network. That's why we argue in advertising, consistency of message is a good thing, because it cements it into our associative network of that brand. Strategist Jeremy Bullmore talks about this in a way that I like, right? People build brands as birds build nests, from scraps and straws we chance upon. I think some people think you can build an associative network with one ad. It's probably unlikely. It's not the way people build associative networks. People build associative networks from, oh, yeah, I remember seeing that ad. Oh, I heard someone talk about it. I saw it in the store. I tried it once. Little bits and bobs end up building what that associative network is, right? So McDonald's may have all these different layers. For me, may be very different for you. Same thing with Starbucks, right? Depending on your experience and the frequency of those associations, you're going to end up with different associations than me. A schema is our worldview based on an associative network. It can be positive or negative. It can be accurate. It can be inaccurate, right? If we see these two nodes of information, more women than men are enrolled in college today, and more women than men are graduating from law school, that will lead to a belief, a proposition. Women are smart. More women in college, more women from law school. And that proposition may lead to a schema. Women are excellent lawyers. Why do we care about a schema? It's because all new information now that comes into our brains that we receive are interpreted through that schema. That's a belief set, an understanding of a topic, and all new information doesn't change it, but gets integrated as part of it. New information that agrees or aligns are incorporated more easily. Things that challenge it will take some time to alter the schema. And any missing information, the brain automatically tries to fill it in as best it can, sometimes inaccurately. When we think about memory and frequency, how many times do you think you would need to see something before you remembered it? Once, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times? More? Most people think, yeah, if I see it 10 times, I'm probably going to remember it. How many times have you seen a US dollar bill or a US quarter or a US penny? You've probably seen a US penny thousands of times if you live in the United States, right? So then I ask you, here's a bunch of pennies, 16 pennies. Which one is the real one? It's hard with 16, I know. But take a look at these for a minute and try and find the one. I mean, you've seen these thousands of times. You should know. Which one is the real penny? I took this test. I got it wrong. I picked the wrong one. Here it is over here. Why, if we've seen something thousands of times, has it not been permanently encoded in our memory that we could scan these quickly and say, it's this one? Because relevance needs to be present too, right? You never had a need to really memorize what the penny looked like. So that lack of relevance didn't really encode it. When we talk about frequency, we also talk about something called the availability heuristic. Why do Americans perceive crime to be worse than it really is? Here's an interesting study by the Pew Research Center. Americans' concern over crime has grown over time, this blue line, while violent crime rates have actually fallen precipitously, causes this big gap of perception. Why is that? Well, one reason is that frequent exposure to this topic gets our attention and distorts our sense of reality. That's what the availability heuristic is. We make the mistake of thinking that things that we experience frequently are more prevalent. And that's just not the case. But look here. Causes of death in the real world. And if we look at violent causes of death, homicides and terrorism, it's a tiny little sliver of all deaths that happen in the country. But look at Google searches. Right here, this is less than 1%. Google searches, 10% of them are about homicides and terrorism. And look at what the main media coverage is. Here's the New York Times and the Guardian. More than half, or roughly half, of their coverage is about homicides and terrorism. So seeing things more frequently, we get a distorted understanding of its prevalence, and we think it occurs more often than it actually does. What makes us forget things? We forget through the passage of time, right? Memories decay, or through interference. New information replaces old information, right? People are prone to forget by omitting. We sort of leave out facts. We average memories, which normalizes them, and then therefore nothing stands out. Or telescoping, which is an inaccurate recall of time. We think things happened more recently than they actually did. Message repetition has an impact on memory retention, but as we discussed, repetition alone is not enough for memory retention. So we see here that the decline of recall, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5 day, 1 week after seeing a stimulus is pretty rapid. After the first reinforcement, that line starts to flatten out and we remember more longer. Same thing after the second and third reinforcement. But the key here is that unless the context is relevant, we're not going to store it in long-term memory. How can we increase recall? We're better able to recall information if our internal state is at the same at the time of recall as when we learn the information. So if we're feeling the same way when we're trying to recall it, the likelihood we're going to recall it is higher. And that must assume that when memories get stored, the emotions that are associated with them get stored at the same time, right? When we have some level of familiarity with an item, we're more likely to recall messages about it. This is something researchers have known for a long time, that people who are more familiar with a brand or a product are more likely to recall it in research because that familiarity drives the recall. They're more likely to notice it in the marketplace and they're more likely to recall it in research. So we have to be careful of the people that we sample and the degree of which we're sampling brand users, people who are familiar with the brand, etc. The Van Restorff effect also says that information that stands out in contrast to its environment are more likely to command attention and increase recall. Well, that says a lot about brand differentiation, right? Brands that are very different will be recalled at a higher level. Prospect theory says that people are more sensitive to changes in states of a thing than to the state itself. So consumers detect and react less to things and more when things change. So we have to be mindful of what are we measuring? Are we measuring a thing or a change in a thing? And if it's a change in a thing, we should expect higher recall of that. Let's talk a bit about memory and emotion. Right? Emotion plays a significant role in memory encoding. The brain believes that if something is important enough to generate an emotion, it must be important enough to remember. This is a survival technique. Cantor has a great quote here that I love. Emotion is the super glue that makes memories stick. The brain prioritizes emotional experiences. Now, some of this comes from evolutionary biology, because the brain would say, that thing might eat me. I'm scared. That fear that I'm feeling, the brain is saying, ooh, this must be a real threat because of what we're feeling. Let's remember this. And next time we see that tiger, run like hell, right? If it's important enough to arouse our emotion, our brain assumes it's important enough to be remembered. This is a wheel of different emotions that we use in the office sometimes. The Plutchik, Robert Plutchik wheel of emotion, developed at Columbia University. And it's kind of neat because it shows these 8 core emotions here with intensifying experience as you get closer to the center. So serenity, more intense version of that is joy, more intense version of that is ecstasy. And that's the same on all these petals of this flower. And then it also looks at what happens when you put 2 of these together. So admiration and ecstasy is love. Ecstasy and vigilant is optimism. Just an interesting way to think about emotions and what are the emotions we are trying to measure in research. But does emotional marketing automatically encode a brand or its message to a consumer's memory? Your assignment for this week actually is to watch these 2 and the next ad, actually. So Thai Life Insurance, Unsung Hero, Ram Trucks Farmer. Both of these are pretty long films. And then Cheerios New Baby Brother, which I think is a 30-second spot. But what you'll notice about all 3 of these are emotional. But is the brand synced with the emotions in the story, and is it central to the story? Right? Think about that, watch those films, and that's going to be your assignment for this week. Check the syllabus. And discuss why that would be. And then we'll talk about those in class. Utilitarian and fact-based ads can sometimes be easily forgettable, right? 526 heart surgeries, 91%, 251%. I don't even know what these are saying, right? But what's the likelihood that I'm going to remember any of these numbers? And I'm not even sure what they mean. Here's another campaign that maybe talks more to the emotional brain. It's pronounced Maimonides, or just tell the ambulance driver you want to live. You could go to the best heart hospital in Manhattan, but why not go to the best heart hospital? If your bucket list is long, your hospital list should be short. These are really, I think, quite good ads and quite different from these. The likelihood that I'm going to remember these, and maybe this is just me personally, but I bet you're the same, is much lower then the likelihood I'm going to remember one of these. Now, emotion for the sake of emotion is rarely effective. So a cute baby, a puppy dog or something, right? Consumers can detect disingenuous emotion a mile away. The emotion a brand taps into has to be one, universally felt, something everybody feels, and it has to be relevant to the story being told in the advertising. Another point on emotion and advertising, emotional content in an ad and stimulating an emotional response in a viewer are two different things. Just showing something emotional, again, puppies, babies, or a couple in love, usually isn't effective if it doesn't stimulate an emotional response in the viewer. The goal is to stimulate an emotional response, not to show cute things. We don't want them to go, aw. We really want them to feel it internally. Here's some data from Kantar that shows ads that evoke stronger emotions generate more engagement. And this is across platforms. This is showing ads with low, medium, and high emotional content. Level of engagement goes up, whether it's TV or digital. Potential to go viral increases dramatically, regardless of the channel and the medium. And the likelihood to drive more short-term and long-term response, right, sales, I'm guessing, increases also with more emotional content across both platforms. So the data supports this as well. And Benet and Field, you would have read the long and short of it in the foundations class, ads evoking stronger emotions, percentage of campaigns with very large profit growth after three or more years. Emotional campaigns, more likely to build profit growth over rational campaigns and even combined rational and emotional campaigns. Professor Damasio, Antonio Damasio, who wrote the book Descartes' Error, which really kicked off kind of the view of how memory and emotions work. He sums it up by saying, we, people, are not thinking machines that feel. Rather, we are feeling machines that happen to think. And Rory Sutherland, who I mentioned in the last lecture, he was speaking at the ARF conference about a decade ago, and he summed up his talk a way that really struck me. He said, we buy things based on how they make us feel. That was really impactful to me. Kiki Pendavis, who runs creative at Nestle, make them laugh, make them cry, but for God's sake, make them feel something. Because change comes from feelings, not from facts. And my favorite quote, Maya Angelou, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So one final thought, in the creative development process, it's important to start by delving deep into the emotions of the consumer, to understand them and their needs, and then figure out how that translates to creating emotional connections through advertising creative. Focus on the emotions. If you want to explore memory a little bit more, these three are linked. 3 60 Minutes episodes that were pretty eye-opening to me about how memory works in people, specifically the first two, the ones called Eyewitness. Really, really impactful about how fallible memory is, even though we hold it up to be this definitive experience. Okay, so that's learning and memory. I hope that was useful to you all. Okay, be well, everybody. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.